Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Meat and three veg, an Aussie barbecue, Anzac biscuits and pavlova. What is Australian food culture? During the mid-20th century, one of the foremost influences on our food culture was the Australian's Women's Weekly, with 25% of households reading the magazine. Joining me to discuss the history of Australian food culture during this time is Dr Lauren Samuelsson. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Lauren.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on. I'm really looking forward to today's chat. This seems to be a very, very interesting and rich topic. And as I was researching it, I learned so much. So yeah, this will be great. Tell me, why did you choose to become a food historian first up? This has got to be an interesting story.
Mostly because I really like food, which helps.
Good start, yes.
But I always also wondered why we make the choices we make when it comes to, say, what we're going to eat for dinner. How did these things get introduced to us? Why do we choose to eat certain things on certain occasions? All of those sorts of questions really interested me, and learning that was what I wanted to do.
And the story of Australia's food culture is so intricately linked to the story of Australia's migration flows.
Yes, absolutely. Starting at colonisation in 1788, that was a massive change for Australian food culture. And from there, with waves of immigration, there has been some massive changes in Australian food culture. So there is that migration link, but there's also things that happened beyond that. Migration seems to be the thing that we default to, saying migration is what caused Australian food culture to be so like multicultural and all of that. But there's other things as well, and they're just as important.
Yeah, there's what's available on the land, isn't there, in different parts of Australia too, how deprivation, poverty, drought, all those things have affected people's creativity and what they've worked out they can eat or can't eat.
Yeah, absolutely. And through Australian food culture, we see that adaptation to Australian climate and environment had a really big impact on Australian food culture in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So can you tell me what Australian food culture reveals about us as a nation? That's a big question, isn't it?
It is a big question. This idea that Australian food culture, and especially when we're looking at that mid-20th century period, that it was really boring and quite bland and all we ate was lamb and potatoes. But
nothing wrong with lamb and potatoes, by the way. I quite like
that. There's nothing wrong with lamb and potatoes. I love lamb and potatoes. But I think that what my research has shown is that people in Australia have always been really innovative and have taken bits and pieces from different food cultures, whatever they were exposed to, and have then taken that and turned it into something that could be considered uniquely Australian. And it's that innovation and adaptation, I think, that really defines Australian food culture. We don't have a cuisine as such, but we do have a food culture. And I think it comes down to that creativity and innovation.
Yeah. I mean, our food culture, it is by its very nature derivative, isn't it? It's derived from colonisation, from waves of migration, from the natural environment. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that Australian food culture, because it has had the opportunity to interact with all of those different things, has made it its own special culture. But yes, it is. It's a mishmash of things that we've taken from other places that people have brought here that we've adapted and adopted. Yeah.
So tell me about prior to multiculturalism, which I guess is a sort of 1970s phenomenon and onwards, there's this impression that Australian cooking was pretty awful. I mean, pretty on par with the reputation that British food has. And look, I quite like British food. My mother's English, so I grew up with quite a lot of it. But yeah, it doesn't have the kind of complex flavours, say, of Thai or Chinese food. But is that unfair? Like pre-multicultural Australia, are we fair in our disparagement of it as a bit stodgy and simplistic?
I mean, I think it is a pretty unfair assessment. But looking back on it with our palates today, which have been, I guess, used to all of these amazing complex flavors, and we have had exposure to those flavors, right? I mean, I certainly grew up having those sorts of things. And I think that to look back on it and judge it from our current state is a bit unfair.
Yeah.
Because the people that we're talking about were working in an incredibly different context than we have now. They didn't have access to a lot of the ingredients that we have today. Olive oil used to be sold in pharmacies as a medicinal thing, right? So it wasn't for cooking, it was for medicine. So that exposure and availability of the things that we take for granted today just wasn't there. So I think it is kind of unfair because these people, and I mostly obviously look at women and women cooking because I study the Women's Weekly, they weren't really interested in other food cultures and they tried hard. Whether or not they got it right, they did try hard to sort of bring in different flavors and to adapt those and create those as well as they could with the limitations that they had.
Can you describe for me, Lauren, what would Robert Menzies have been eating in the 1950s? What was a Menzies era 1950s typical Australian family dinner?
Sure. When we look at dinners back then, they were a lot more elaborate than what we have today as well. When we look at things that people were suggested to eat for meals, they would often be 3 courses. And quite frankly, I don't have the time for that. No. So it would usually be something to start, maybe a soup of some kind, and then it would be a meat and 3 veg. It might be the lamb roast on a Sunday that then people would use the leftovers to then create like a shepherd's pie on Monday, and then they'd use the bone later in the week for soup. So there was a definite frugality about it and a waste not, want not mentality as well. But it was definitely that meat and 3 veg and then just reused in different ways. And then dessert, always a dessert, whether it was as simple as tinned fruit with ice cream, because by the 1950s, Australians were mostly getting into home refrigeration in a lot bigger way. Or it could be a pie or cakes, those sorts of things. Always dessert.
I'm sorry we've lost that tradition. I think always dessert's a great, great tradition to hold on to. There's a quote here from Englishman Richard Tuppenny who says, or who claims at least, that meat is the staple of Australian life. A working man whose family did not eat meat 3 times a day would indeed be a phenomenon. That's interesting. So there's a meat incorporated in each meal, in your breakfast, in your lunch, and in your dinner. Was there a sense that if there wasn't meat, it wasn't a meal?
Yeah, basically. And that
tough times
really,
for vegetarians, I guess.
Oh, as far as the weekly was concerned, in the mid-20th century, vegetarians did not exist.
No, it was a medical problem.
Right. Really, that sort of reliance on meat actually came about as a way to differentiate Australia from Britain. In Australia, it was seen as like the working man's paradise, and the availability of meat to everyone was seen as this amazing thing in this new colony that no matter how rich you were, you could afford to eat meat. And that was really different to Britain, where people who were working class often maybe only had meat once a week, and that would have been on Sunday. And then maybe they would have little bits here and there, but to eat meat 3 times a day was a really big draw card. Carolyn Chisholm used it in order to get migrants to come over to Australia as part of like that draw card. How amazing and how fruitful this land is that everyone can have meat 3 times a day. And that stuck around for a really long time. And people were eating meat for breakfast well into the 1950s. Chops and steak and liver. And I mean, to me, that sounds pretty awful every day. But yeah, it was just the way that things were.
I feel like the expectation of meat, at least for dinner, is still there in Australia. I know my dad always says, what animal are we having tonight when I have dinner with him? It's like, okay, it has to be an animal.
Yeah. Yeah. The idea that meat is the central component to the meal is definitely still there, for sure.
Yeah. And is that distinctively Australian? I mean, you were saying it was used as an advertising strategy for drawing migrants to Australia from, say, Britain that was plentiful. But is that something that is still distinctive for Australia? I mean, if you go to America or Britain, like, are Australians much more obsessed with having meat as part of a meal?
I think America probably has us beat terms of that because they were running on the same thing, that they had this space, they had all of these resources that were available. It was a land of plenty, all of that stuff. And Britain really only got into that probably after the Second World War, once there was a bit more economic progression, I suppose. But certainly, I don't think it's necessarily Australian, but Australians are still, I think we're third in the world for meat eating after America and Israel.
Oh.
Yeah.
I guess having lived in a few different countries, that probably doesn't surprise me. My experience of Japan is not really very much meat eaten there at all. Obviously fish and eggs and things like that. But tell me about the influence of this new magazine in the 1930s, the Australian Women's Weekly, because you're saying that women are putting actually quite a lot of thought and effort into these elaborate three-course meals at dinner and obviously having to source meat for breakfast and lunch as well. They were no doubt getting ideas from somewhere. And this, of course, is where we have that iconic publication, the Australian Women's Weekly, coming in.
Yeah, so the weekly started in 1933. This was the tail end of the Depression, and it came about because Frank Packer, who was working in conjunction with a guy called Edward Theodore, who had been the Premier of Queensland and had also been the Treasurer of Australia in the Scullin government, were looking to expand their newspaper business. And they bought this failing newspaper called The World. And when they bought that, they also had to buy all of the machinery that went along with it. So they had to buy these printing presses and what have you, but they didn't have anything to print. And so this guy called George Wernicke, who had been working at the Daily Telegraph for Frank Packer's dad, had this idea to create a women's newspaper, a women's magazine that would be, I think he said, of interest to all women in Australia, and that it would have this Australian outlook. And he had all of these amazingly big plans for this magazine. And they took a chance on it to get that printing press working, and it worked out well for them. The first issue was released in June 1933. They printed 50,000 copies. It was only distributed in Sydney, but they sold out, and they ended up selling 120,000 copies of that first issue. So it was like a huge success from the very beginning. And by a couple of years later, that expanded to all states in Australia. They also had a New Zealand version of the Australian Women's Weekly, which was confusing because there was also a New Zealand Women's Weekly. Direct competition there. They were selling it in Fiji. It went viral, I suppose, before that term came about. And food was really important in the magazine from the start. Like, the very first issue had a cookery column, and it also had a call for readers to send in their best recipe for a weekly recipe competition. And that structure, having an editorial and then also having readers' recipes, was the structure that they followed for a really long time.
And what was the focus of the food column? I mean, it's interesting. I think in some of your research, you chart this focus from nutrition to embellishments and elaborate cooking. It was really focused on eat this to be strong, for your eyes, for your skin, that type of real focus on nourishing your family.
Yeah. So we have to think about what the world was like in the 1930s and 1940s, which is when this focus on nutrition was really there. In the 1930s, nationally, but also globally, people were really concerned about malnutrition. They had just been through a huge global shock with the Great Depression that affected what people could eat. And so the Commonwealth government in particular was really concerned about what people were eating. They were so concerned that they set up a commission to look into the diet of the nation to find out what people were eating. Were people getting enough food? Were children getting enough food? Was a real concern. And so that anxiety about how are we creating a strong nation? And this is all linked back to nation building. And there's also this idea of creating a strong population, and those ideas about eugenics and things are all tied into that. But they were really concerned about that. And that comes through on the pages of the magazine. It wasn't necessarily how good things tasted, but are you getting enough vitamin B? Are you making sure that you're getting enough carbohydrates? Those sorts of things were really of concern. And obviously that went into the Second World War as well, because all of a sudden we didn't necessarily have the foods that we relied upon because of rationing and so on and so forth. And there was also this idea we had to make strong people so that we could have strong soldiers. So we also had to have strong women who were having healthy babies and all of those sorts of things in order to support the nation. Those sorts of things came through in the magazine. And then after the Second World War, that disappeared because it wasn't as important anymore.
So where did this tradition of food columns evolve? Because it didn't just start with Australian Women's Weekly, did it, in the 1930s, although that obviously really popularised it and spread its reach through such massive sales. I can't believe that 25% of the Australian households were reading it. That seems extraordinary.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. It was the highest selling magazine per capita in the entire world, women's magazine. So it was astoundingly popular, and it's sort of hard to get our minds around that in our media landscape today, where we have so many different things vying for our attention. But really, this was one of the main ways that people got to talk to each other. And that cookery column had been around for a while. Newspapers had had cooking columns in their women's pages for quite a few decades. So people were kind of used to communicating through those. They would write in and ask for tips, and people would send in recipes. And it became a way that women built a community around food. It was just a community that was happening in the pages. And I think that the Women's Weekly just took it that little step further, which is what made it so popular. They had amazing illustrations and pictures. And because it had such a wide reach, it was going to so many places, so many people were exposed to it, that community got bigger. And so it just took it, the next step up.
It's amazing to think how influential one publication could have been on such a significant 50% of the population were women. The food element to Australian Women's Weekly, was that the central element, or was it like we kind of know it now, a lot of stories about the royal family and movie stars and
yeah.
Being caught in their bathers or frowning, or I don't know who's marrying who, who's having a baby with who.
There was definitely that aspect to it. And obviously the food pages only made up a small segment of the magazine, but it was a very popular segment of the magazine. And as part of my research, I talked and did a survey of lots of readers of the weekly, and heaps of them told me that pretty much the only reason they bought the magazine was for the recipes. So it was important. And the way that the weekly treated the food pages also tells us about how important it was. So during the Second World War, when there was paper rationing, the weekly had to drop the amount of pages that it published in each issue, like significantly. And large sections of the magazine were cut, but the food pages stayed, and they were also printed in colour, which was expensive. So that tells us how important those pages were to the magazine at that point in time.
And tell me about the personalities who were writing for the food pages, because they became sort of household names, didn't they, these food writers? I mean, maybe like the Donna so Hay of the 1930s and 40s, 50s.
Yeah. So in the very beginning, in line with that idea that nutrition was really important, a lot of the people that were working in the test kitchen were actually trained home economists who worked in hospitals, teaching nurses what to feed ill people and those sorts of things. And so they were really highly trained women. So we have people like Margaret Shepherd, who was the actual first food editor that was employed on a long-term basis. She was a lecturess for the New South Wales Health and went around talking and giving lectures and talking about nutrition and all of those sorts of things. She wrote a cookbook. So these people were pretty good at their jobs. We also have in the 1940s, Olwen Francis, who worked throughout the war, which would have been a really tough time to be, I think, food editor of the weekly. But when she came on board, the weekly was like really keen to point out exactly how well qualified she was. So she had done all of this training. She'd then gone over to London and had worked in London under a nutritionist there. And so that expertise was really, really important, particularly during that time where people really worried about the health of their food. And then after the war, we saw a pretty distinct change when we were introduced to the weekly's food editor, Leela C. Howard, who was not a real person.
So why was that? Why did they have a made-up person?
I have a theory. There's a story going around that's been retold that Frank Packer didn't want any of his staff to become stars in their own right. And so he decided to make this pen name so that none of the women could become famous.
Become indispensable too, and then demand a higher wage, presumably.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all
exactly.
dispensable because Leela is the woman people read, not you.
Yes. I don't know that that's necessarily true, though, because Packer had been involved with the magazine even when people were using their names from the 1930s onwards. I think that it was very much about the way that the weekly was being influenced by America at the time. So after the 1940s, there was a huge American influence on Australian food culture through to about 1960-ish, I would say. And at that point in time in America, the most well-known woman in food was Betty Crocker, and she was also fictional.
Oh, was she? I never knew that.
Yeah. And most of the American public didn't know that either, because during the Second World War, I think Time magazine did a survey and they said that Betty Crocker was the second most well-known woman in America after Eleanor Roosevelt. So incredibly popular. People didn't know she wasn't real. And I really think that the weekly was aiming to do something similar. But it also did give them the opportunity to have a food editor that no matter who was coming and going behind the scenes, the readers could trust. So it was a touchstone that they had in there as well. So yeah, the first woman who was Leela C. Howard, her real name was Leela.
Oh, right.
And I think she might have chosen the pen name because her middle name was also Carmian, so Leela C. Her last name was Maynard, though, so I don't know where the Howard came from. But from that point on, for about 20 years, Leela C. Howard was the weekly's food editor.
It's interesting too that Americans often use the middle name, or at least the initial, in their title. It's not an Australian tradition at all. But I wonder if that's that American influence, like Leela C. Howard, Michael J. Fox. You have the sort of full name with the initial.
Yeah, it very well could be.
So tell me, Leela C. Howard, the famous fictitious food editor, what was she pushing? So she's obviously moving away from this focus on nutrition. I mean, is this the sort of multi-course, 10-course show-off dinner parties of the 1950s and 60s that we think of?
Yes, absolutely.
I look at those dinner party suggested menus from that era and just think the poor woman, invariably, who had to cook all that food, probably 4 days.
Oh, 100%. Sometimes they were telling people to start getting ready for dinner parties 2 weeks in advance. So they were not easy things to do. But yes, that is exactly the cooking that she was pushing. There was a shift towards things that were a lot more involved, a lot more elaborate, a lot more expensive, and a lot more time consuming. Like these dishes were time consuming on the most part. Of course, they always offered quick, easy somethings that you could throw together. But yeah, it was very much that elaborate cooking that we think of.
And this is linked to a period when Australia's going through an economic boom, wages are rising, there's much more disposable income, people, husbands, let's be honest, almost all are employed. I mean, unemployment rate was, I know in South Australia there was one point in the 1950s when there were only 3 people registered as being unemployed. So there were a lot of jobs around. So you're seeing in the recipes and the cookery columns that evidence of that change in our society, in economic conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not only the economic conditions, it's also the way that we were living. In the 1950s, there was this move to the suburbs, your house and your quarter-acre block and all of those sorts of things. And we see that in the weekly as well. So this is where dinner parties became really popular, because you would invite people over to your gorgeous home so that you could serve them dinner and show off your wealth, basically, and the fact that you were living the Australian dream in your lovely suburban home.
Prior to then, dinner parties weren't much of a thing? You wouldn't have entertained at home?
Not the way that they did in the 1950s. So you would have parties at home, but they were often smaller and maybe just like a luncheon party where you would have some friends over or something like that. A lot less formal, and that definitely changed. People's houses were getting bigger and stuff as well, so there was actually room to entertain people. Hosting a dinner party for 8 to 10 people in a small space is quite difficult. But once you've got your lovely 3-bedroom house with your beautiful modern kitchen and lovely dining room and all of those things that were sort of aspirational, then have people over. You've got the space. It's wonderful.
And how popular in that time in the 50s was American food fashions, and think of the sort of American 1950s kitchens full of new appliances, and they certainly had a style that we're familiar with through popular culture. Was that being imported by Leela C. Howard?
Absolutely, yes. She was a big fan of the home appliance. Lots of, we would call them advertorials today. This is how you use your Sunbeam Mixmaster to create this beautiful cake. This is how you use your amazing Sunbeam fry pan to create this beautiful dinner. This is what you use this appliance for, this appliance. She was very keen on the TV. Only a year after TV was introduced to Australia, she gave people a recipe feature to tell them what they could eat in front of the TV, which was pretty controversial, eating in front of the TV. But also Australians didn't really have many TVs at that point in time. So that was like very aspirational and very American. And she also told them to eat brain canapes in front of the TV. So I don't know how well people would have taken to it, but she was trying.
What are the types of food she was introducing to Australian housewives?
So it was very, I guess, what we would consider to be American at that point in time. But American at that point in time was really influenced by French cuisine, because French cuisine had always been seen as the pinnacle, right, of cuisine. It was seen as being very classy. It was definitely like a restaurant type of cookery, and that style of French cooking, not the French cooking that came in later in the 1960s, where it was like things like casseroles and cassoulets and those more rustic French cuisines. This was fancy. So we see that definitely coming through. And she was also a fan of what she called glamorizing. So just jazzing up a meal in some way. So it could just be a simple meal, but you would elaborately decorate it with beautiful garnishes, or you would add in certain things to just give it a little pop. That was one of her favorite things to do.
What about that American cook, Julia Child? I mean, she was very much drawing on French influences. Was that coming through with Leela C. Howard's columns?
Yeah, and there was actually a French chef who was the first woman TV chef, called Dione Lucas. She was American, and the Weekly was very keen on introducing her to the Australian public. They paid for her to come to Australia 3 times from the late 1950s into the early 1960s and sent her around Australia to do cooking demonstrations for people. And Leela C. Howard would accompany her on these jaunt around Australia. They would publish her recipes. So it was definitely being pushed to the public, this sort of cookery.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I even think of my childhood, Gabrielle Gatte, who was very, very popular back in the 80s, French chef resident in Australia. And it was considered very high cuisine for Australia, wasn't it?
Yeah. And French food still has that connotation about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Before we move on to some of the things we were cooking at that time, I wondered if you could just talk to me about mock foods. I mean, I appreciate this is slightly before the sort of advent of Leela C. Howard. I mean, I remember reading about mock chicken and mock turtle soup. That was another one, wasn't it? But haven't ever featured on menus that I have eaten. I think they've been more referred to in books of that era. What was it all about, mock food, for a start?
Yeah. Look, I guess...
Why not just have the real thing?
So mock foods was a response to not being able to access a particular ingredient at various points in time. It could have either been because it was too expensive, which is what often the cause was, but it could also be because something was out of season. And we sort of forget seasonal eating now when everything's available all the time. But when people's food and diet was dictated by the seasons, that was often a reason that people would do mock foods. But mock foods were basically foods that were designed to either look like something else or taste like something else. And the something else that they were designed to look like or taste like was usually something that was more expensive and had a higher cultural connotation to it. So mock turtle soup, for example, really, really popular, started in Victorian times. And it was popular because turtles, this is in Britain, turtles were really expensive because they had to be brought back from the Caribbean. So only the very richest in society could have real turtle soup. And so the middle class, who were trying to sort of ape their betters, created mock turtle soup that was made by boiling a calf's head. Doesn't sound fantastic, but apparently it gave the same gelatinous texture as turtle soup had.
Have you ever tried mock turtle soup?
Yeah. And that became really popular. They started canning it, and then it worked its way down the class ladder to a point where everyone could enjoy it, and then it fell out of favour. So that's what we see these things tend to do, right? They start at the top and they trickle their way down the economic ladder, as it were.
So when you were, say, cooking I know that in July 1944 there was a recipe for mock chicken chow mein. Would you say this is mock chicken chow mein to your family? Or would you just say it's chicken chow mein? Would it be shameful to have used, well, in this case, it's rabbit, isn't it, instead of chicken?
Yes, yeah. It wasn't shameful at all. I think that they sort of took pride in the ability to dress something up as something that it wasn't. Certainly all of the recipes that I found for these mock foods didn't hide the fact that they were pretending to be something that they weren't. They used words like mock, obviously, but then also like sham. There's a recipe for sham potatoes, which was flour and dripping dumplings that you would cook in the roast juices after the roast so that you would have these potatoes, that you sort of shape them like a potato. Potatoes were in short supply. So they made these dumplings, and they weren't really, I think, expecting it to be the same thing. It was just this naming convention that gave it a certain oomph and made it seem a little bit maybe more palatable, especially when it was something like rabbit, which was seen as a real food of poverty. Just being able to dress it up and make it seem as if it wasn't quite so bad. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's interesting. It was quite a common terminology back in the day, but if you were trying to ape the upper classes, you'd wonder if maybe you'd try and just be more discreet about it. But yet people were open about it. So
yeah, they were.
When people overseas, I guess, think about Australian cuisine to the extent they do, I guess the barbecue, throw a few shrimps on the barbie and that kind of steak, that is quite a powerful image that is out there. But that's not necessarily an Australian phenomenon, is it? I mean, this is another example of us being so derivative.
Yes, to an extent. The barbecue as we know it, sort of the backyard gas or wood burning barbecue, it was definitely an American import that came in after the Second World War. Obviously, barbecue in American cuisine is very different to the barbecue that we have. So barbecue in America is slow, it's smoked, all of those things. So we sort of stole the name and took their grilling culture and misnamed it to create our barbecues. But Australians had been cooking over open flames for a really long time. It wasn't a new concept. In the early 20th century and late 19th century, there were these things called chop picnics that people would go on, which was basically they would get together, they might go out into the bush, they'd start a little fire, put a grate over it and cook chops.
So that would just be called a chop picnic. It wouldn't term barbecue doesn't come into Australian food terminology until the 50s then.
Until the 50s. And people were not happy about the term barbecue. There's a guy wrote into the Weekly in the early 1960s just complaining that we need to get rid of this Americanism barbecue, just call it a chop picnic, that's what it is. And he was very upset.
And what if you're having sausages or a steak?
Right. And he was very upset about what he was calling cocktail barbecues. Not okay. We had to go back to the more rustic version of barbecues, in his opinion. So we kind of took barbecues, we sort of stole it from the Americans, but we turned it into our own thing. And it was that barbecue, the one in the backyard, that really became part of Australian culture.
And so that is quintessentially Australian. The grill, gas,
Americans,
wood-fired, frying, grilling various meats in your backyard. That quite quickly, obviously, not a slow-cooked affair. That is an Australian development.
Yeah, I sort of tried to have a look at how Australian this barbecue thing was. New Zealand do a lot of barbecues as well in a similar style, but lots of Australian and New Zealand food culture is quite similar at times. We're constantly fighting over who invented the pavlova. But places like Canada, for example, they had barbecues, but they were often like indoor, and because of the weather, Australians have much better weather and take advantage of that. So once again, that's a part of the climate, a part of sort of our natural environment that encouraged us to eat in certain ways.
I guess there's South African barbecues too, isn't there?
And
maybe that's
and Argentinian barbecue, and there's barbecuing as this whole doesn't belong to one culture. Everyone cooks over fire in some way.
We did it the Australian way. Were there other food traditions that were imported and then given an Australian tweak or became quintessentially Australian by virtue of the way we adapted to them?
Yeah, especially when it came to ingredients. So one that springs to mind is pumpkin. So Australia, I think pumpkins came over on the first fleet, and in Britain, pumpkins were seen as being animal fodder. They were food for animals. They weren't worthy of being on the table. When people started planting pumpkins in Queensland, though, because of the environment there, pumpkins loved it, went absolutely rampant. So Queenslanders had just mountains and mountains of pumpkins. What to do with a pumpkin, right? So they created things like pumpkin scones, which are an Australian version of a Scottish dish, the scone, that were made because people just had so many pumpkins. And they became incredibly popular around the turn of the 20th century. I think we've got the first recipe for one being published in about 1913 or so. But obviously, by the time it's printed, people had probably been sharing this recipe around between themselves, between friends. So that has been around for a really long time and is an example of how Australians take something that we've got a lot of and turn it into something that's Australian.
We also adapted, didn't we, some Chinese foods. I mean, I think of dim sims you get in fish and chip shops. They're not actually a Chinese dish, but they sound it. And I think people assume they are. But they're Australian, aren't they?
They are. And Chico rolls are an Australian Chinese adaptation. So the guy who invented Chico rolls, he used to sell like meat pies and things at sporting events. And one day he saw someone selling Chinese spring rolls. And he thought, that's not a bad idea. I'm going to create something that's like that. But he wanted it to be sturdy enough that you could hold a beer in one hand and a Chico roll in the other and it wouldn't fall apart. And so that's why it's got that thick batter around the outside. And that became quintessentially Australian too. And it was an adaptation of Chinese food turned into something that, you know, you couldn't go to a sporting event or to the beach or what have you without a Chico roll.
Yeah, indeed. So I wanted to finish our discussion, Lauren, with a chat about food competitions. I grew up in country South Australia, so the local country show where you take your nice cake, scones, biscuits, whatever, enter them in, hopefully win a prize. You know, people who did really well at these competitions, they had sort of a certain status in society. Like, it was a big deal. These country show cooking competitions, were they quintessentially Australian thing? I mean, what were they doing to food culture?
They were definitely incredibly popular from the very first moment they started. And I think that the most important thing that those competitions did was that they elevated home cooking to a point where people saw it as being something to be very proud of. It's something that was for women. The Royal Easter Show in Sydney didn't even let men enter the competition until the 1920s. Right. And it had been around for a long time by then. So it was a way that women could show their ability in a type of cooking that had probably been looked down on. Because when we think about the difference in genders cooking, men work in restaurants, right? They're chefs. Whereas women cook in the home and they're cooks. And there's a very large difference between those things. And this was a way that women could actually get accolades for the hard work that they put in. And you're right, they did get a social cachet. The fact that Mary won the fruitcake competition, she could ride on that for a long time socially. And the competitions are still incredibly popular, those competitions at the show. I love going to the shows and looking at people's cake decorating, and just the time and effort and care they put into those things is phenomenal. And it was also, I think, the idea of competition was quite fun. And competition became a part of the way, especially that the Weekly created Australian food culture as well.
I mean, it's interesting. There are reality TV shows, of course, around cooking, you know, MasterChef and the like, My Kitchen Rules. But there was this Butter White Wings bake-off, wasn't there, from 1963 to 1970. And was it the 1970 was actually televised? The final?
Yes, yeah, it was. The final was televised. As far as I'm aware, the first cooking competition televised in Australia. The Butter White Wings Bake Off was just this huge competition. So it ran from 1963 to 1970. Every year they got people to send in recipes, and they had different categories that people could send their recipes in for. Every week they would have a prize that they would give to people in each of these categories. And then at the end of the competition, all of the finalists were flown to either Melbourne or to Sydney, and they would do a cooking demonstration in front of people, usually in a department store like David Jones or in the middle of a shopping centre, something like that. It was very big, very showy. They'd cook for the judges would judge, and they would win these amazing prizes if they won. Like overseas holidays, people were winning cars. It was pretty phenomenal. Yeah.
I still think we're doing that these days through all these reality TV shows. We have more.
It's a different format.
Yeah, different format, but we're still interested in cooking. We're still competitive about our cooking, aren't we? And adapting as society changes to different tastes and traditions and cultures.
Yeah, exactly. Different technologies that we have, because in 1970, when that first televised thing went out, apparently 2 million people watched it. So cooking on TV was hot stuff, and it still is. And now, of course, we have things like social media where people film themselves cooking on there and share recipes through that. So it's just, changing with the times, adapting and doing the same thing that we've been doing for a really long time, just in different ways.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light to talk about this period of Australian history and the food culture within. I think it's a fascinating snapshot of what we were like back then and how we were adapting to so many things, our natural environment, the people around us, the rise of technology, changing economic conditions. All of these things feed into what we were putting in our mouths.
Been a pleasure.
Thanks. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.